Chapter 1.10, Engaging with Form and Content, Part 3. Part 1 and Part 2 were done at kind of a different time, so just note if my tone of voice is different. We are in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak. I'm a little bit somber. Okay, so I hope you are all well and healthy, and I'll go through this as best I can. So we looked at formal, I'm going to back up a little bit, religious context a little bit with the votive figures in the second video, and now we're going to get into historical context. Okay, so we're going to get into contextual analysis. So there's really different ways of looking at artwork, and I think students kind of default to this sort of an idea of what was going on at that time, or what's going on for them at this time, and seeing it through that lens. So each artwork can be analyzed in multitude of different ways, and we're going to do that with Las Meninas when we're in a couple pages. But for this particular piece, we're going to look at the historical context only, and we're going to look at the subject matter here, people in a neighborhood gathering on stoops, and they are after church, and we can kind of see that through the hats are still on in place, and people are coming back from the church here and onto their porches. Now, the idea here that we're looking at, or the time frame we're looking at, is 1936. We're sort of at the end of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a time period in the 20s and 30s for African Americans where they were really explored and published a lot of literature and music and visual art. So it was really important. U.S. northern cities, of course, it came out of Harlem in upper New York City, but it did affect some other areas of the country as well. But this is our Palmer Hayden painting depicting what looks, like a street in Harlem, and this is what his locality is. So a few things are happening. He has some realism in there to a degree, clear representational. Fire hydrant, the car, the grill, and the tire, and the proportions of the car look very realistic, and he wants us to notice those details. He's emphasizing that it's a realistic time and place, but it's a little more joyful and expressive. Expressionism has already kind of happened in Europe, and this has some Matisse sort of references to me with the flat areas of color. He had studied in Paris in the 20s, so he's got some of these different techniques. He's seen Picasso, he's seen Matisse, he's seen different painting styles, so it's a bit stylistic and abstract as well, not super representational, and you can even see some impressionism or post-impressionism sort of in the dirt areas. And then his color palette he's using, which are traditional African art and colors, big flat areas of color, bright hues, big bright areas of color. So not a lot of detail in the fabrics, of course, not a lot of detail in terms of high representational or realism, because he's sort of expressing it in a more emotional context. So it's capturing the time and place. Okay, so now we're going to get into a biographical context. I know there's a lot of different things for you to take in, but we'll go through, and the book is really good about breaking this down sort of piece by piece. So what is an artist's personal experience, and how they may have affected the making of that work? So we're going to look at Abakanowitz, Magdalena Abakanowitz's 80 Backs. This is a really famous piece. It showed in a lot of different museums, and in this case, she's photographed it in an external area, but she replicated this a lot and showed this quite a bit. So in her mind, when she was in Poland, growing up, post World War II in a communist country, um, what she was being asked to do as an artist was to do representational, sort of almost like illustration, advertising sort of things, propaganda of people and heroic moments. And there's a lot of that Soviet art from around World War II and beyond. But they really tended toward representationalism, not what everybody else in the world, in the contemporary world of art, modern art, were doing, such as highly abstracted things. And that was kind of where she was thinking a little bit more. And she became a weaver, and she didn't want to make realistic depictions of these heroic workers. We're on page 178 here. She wanted to explore some issues of identity and of courage, and about the sort of being in a group. Now these don't have heads; they're just the backs. So these are sort of commenting on a totalitarian government without really exactly pointing a finger. So she was sort of able to get away with that in a way. So they're repeated figures. So this is on page 178. I'm reading. This reflects her experience of the communist regime's emphasis on the collective over the individual and its attempts to control personal expression. In 80 backs, the burlap fabric is shaped into recognizable but abstracted human forms without heads or faces. And she says a human being turned into a crowd loses his human qualities. So she's trying to comment on that sense of a lack of uniqueness or individuality in a communist country. That's one thing she's trying to focus on. And another part of this is that they're made out of burlap. They're not made out of an expensive casting material. She didn't have access to those things. In reality, under the regime, she was, Soviet regime, in Poland, the materials were scarce. So she kind of became, an experimenter with fabrics and things like that. And she was able to cast these burlap backs into these different forms. If I remember correctly, and the book's not covering this, is that they were cast of real persons. You can kind of see a little bit more here. They were actually people that she made molds of, and then she put wet burlap with some kind of binder in it, probably like a glue or an epoxy or something, into a resin, into that form, and then was able to cast these. But these were quite powerful, quite famous. At the time that she's made this in 76-80, communism was really thriving in Poland, and she was commenting in a sort of subtle way against the regime that was exploitative. Okay, so we're going to get into analysis, critique, and interpretation. So description, discussion, and related to the artwork. So you always kind of have to describe things, and I think I tell you guys that over and over. Make sure you're describing the work as you're putting the analysis in, because it really helps show that you understand the concept and where those things that you're talking about are. Critique is theory, but it's also ideas, opinions, and experiences of the viewer. So if you've had an art critique, if you've ever been in a situation where either your own artwork is being critiqued, or you're in a museum or anywhere where everybody's discussing something, and if you haven't, then you could think about an event and somebody's describing something to you and they're going, no, it's like this. Yes, it's like that. So there are some opinions and experiences that conflict or aren't completely clear. We're not completely objective. We're all bringing things to our own interpretation. And then interpretation gets into critical review, commentary, judgment of the writer, and it's not necessarily negative. Like critical sometimes means negative, or it means that they found flaws with it, but that's not really what it means in the art world. If you've had a critical review, or if you're being criticized, we don't really use that word criticized, critiqued is what we use. then that means you're being evaluated and the work is being looked at and considered. And it's an honor in a lot of ways to have something critiqued or looked at in any kind of serious way. It's definitely an honor to have any kind of a write-up in this huge world we're living in with so few art critics out there. To have somebody actually notice your work and write about it, it's a big deal. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. So analysis is going to relate more directly to the time of the artwork, and critique and interpretation can include considerations that happened since that time. So when we get into like a feminist critique, which is the one we're about to go into, then we're looking at old works of art and we are considering some critical thoughts that we have as women now, how we're looking at these works, and then even recontextualizing a little bit of perhaps why they might have been made. Now remember, we had contextual analysis. When you think of a nude portrait being painted of a goddess, in the contextual analysis it was acceptable because that would be the form that they were found in. Okay, so when we get into feminist analysis, we're going to consider the subject of the role of the women as subjects, creators, patrons, and viewers, and it can reflect the intentions of the artist, but it's also talking about where we are now. That's not putting it very well. I'm sorry. So Ingres here has the Grand Odalisque, 1814. Now there were nudes before his time. And we have a little side note in the textbook on page 179 for the Venus of Urbino. It's a Titian painting in the Renaissance, 1538. So there's precursors, and we know from Botticelli's Venus also earlier than that, there were nudes. But in Odalisque, a particular form like this, the woman's posed in a particular way, and then she's also what they would have called back then sort of orientalized or made to seem exotic. And in this case, the exotic world that is known to Europe isn't so much the Far East, which we may think of, pardon my rooster, I'm going to close the door, what we would think about, but the Near East, or really even south of Europe. They're talking about Morocco, they're talking about places in the Near East or the Middle East, as we sometimes call it, or Mediterranean area. So the idea that these women are living in this sort of sensual world where men are not available, and there's all these soft fabrics and incense burning and pleasant things happening, and it's all female, that sort of titillated or, engaged men to think about them, right? So we have a French artist painting this for a French audience. Now he's painting it for a male French audience because a woman in a harem isn't really something another woman is particularly interested in. And I'm going to go into, so I'm going to say this from the book 179, then I'm going to stop here. Feminist analysis is a subset of biographical analysis when it studies the life experience of women artists in relation to their work. Feminist analysis has been expanded to include gender studies, and feminist critique additionally considers viewers' perspectives toward gender, the treatment of women as subjects, and the role of women at the time the artwork was made. In this particular case, we are giving a male patron. We don't know who the patron is at this moment, but the patron was painted, asked for this portrait, or perhaps knew that Ingres had others like it, says, I would like to have a nude female reclining to admire. So in that way, we're kind of